So I've said that the First Amendment was created in different times for different conditions. And many of you may start thinking about the framing, the founding of the Constitution, the writing of the Bill of Rights, 1791. Some of you may know a little more about the First Amendment, but I'll tell you if you're, something that many Americans are surprised to learn, which is that the First Amendment was a dead letter for most of American history. The First Amendment did nothing until really the first signs of life in the 1920s, and really only became active in the 1950s through 60s. So it's one of these ancient American traditions, like the Super Bowl, that turns out not to really be that old at all. It's like, it's a couple decades. In fact, it's important to think of that because it's actually a fragile tradition. Even until the 30s and 40s, you could be arrested in the United States for espousing communism. Even in the early days, right after the writing of the Constitution, they said all this stuff. People were thrown in prison for criticizing the federal government. So the idea of America as a particularly speech-tolerant, speech-upholding place is really something that has to do with the latter parts of the 20th century. And I think that's important because it suggests we could lose it. It suggests we could go back to the way the things used to be. So let me give you some evidence that, frankly, things weren't always as we thought. In 1791, Congress in the states had ratified the Bill of Rights, which obviously has the First Amendment as at the head of it. Nonetheless, just 7 years later, Congress passes the Sedition Act of 1798, signed by President John Adams, who's otherwise usually a pretty good guy, but in this one, he really blew it. I kind of look up, he kind of stands for virtue and stuff, but he signs this law that makes it a crime to criticize the federal government. This is only 7 years after the Bill of Rights. And they go out and they prosecute people for criticizing the federal government. The excuse was, well, we're kind of in war with France, even though they were our allies earlier. Now we're at war, and we got to do this. So here's one example I was looking up. There was a fellow named Matthew Leon from Vermont. And so here's what he said about the administration. He said it was an administration of ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. Said that wrong, but so he was prosecuted in prison for 4 months. He was a congressman. He was put in prison for 4 months for criticizing the administration. So that's the early Bill of Rights tradition. It's not much of a tradition. Now, to be sure, there were people who thought this was wrong. Madison and Thomas Jefferson didn't think this was an appropriate use of government power. But it's still striking that you had these prosecutions upheld by courts, right around the Bill of Rights. And then you have a great silence, not a lot of activation. And the real founding period of the First Amendment, where it got its ideas, where it really all started was in the 1920s. And in reaction to some of the censorship that showed up around the First World War. And you have it is these three judges in particular, very famous judges, learned hand, Louis Brandeis, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who kickstart the whole thing. So they're really the founders of the First Amendment tradition in the United States. And they were very courageous and bold in what they did. They brought it to life. It's kind of a good lesson in how constitutional law works. It does take these moments where justices have to react and assert what they think is right to really change things. I should say for all those justices, all of them were committed to majoritarian rule. It was difficult for them to come around to it, but it was the actions of the United States during the First World War that I think made them feel it was just too much. I think sometimes it's important, as we are in these times where we think about whether the United States is getting more extreme, nationalistic, even edging upon fascist tendencies. It's not completely alien to this country. In the First World War, you had an executive agency named the Committee for Public Information, run by a guy named George Creel. And its basic idea, this is during World War I, is that there should not be dissent in the United States when it came to the war, or frankly, almost anything. And I'll read you a quote of, this is like the top, propaganda official for the United States in World War I. He said, the will to win of a democracy depends on the degree of which every one of the people in the democracy can concentrate and consecrate body and soul and spirit in the supreme effort of service and sacrifice. We need to weld the people of the United States into one white-hot mass, instinct with fraternity, devotion, courage, and deathless determination. You know, it sounds almost, I was comparing this to some of Mussolini's speeches at the same time, not much different. This idea of this sort of supreme will that overcomes individual decision-making, individual capacities, and welds the whole country into one will. You know, we sort of had this. So eventually, you know, that was the spirit. A new sedition act was passed during the First World War, and it was used pretty roughly. Some of you may know the story, but Eugene Debs was the founder of the American Socialist Party. He was running for president in 1918, and you know, he gave a speech where he said, he basically said that everyone who opposes the war is being treated like a criminal. You know, I'll give you the quote. He says, "The brand of treason is being applied to men who dare to even whisper their opposition to the war." And then he spoke to this audience in Ohio, Canton, Ohio, and he said, you know, mostly workers, "You are fit for something better than slavery and cannon fodder. You need to know that you were not created to work and to produce and impoverish yourself to enrich an idle exploiter. You need to know that you have a mind to improve, a soul to develop, and a manhood to sustain." So he gives a speech, you know, sort of discouraging people, obviously not very favorable for the war, but a U.S. attorney was in the audience. Debs was indicted, convicted, sentenced for 10 years, just for giving a speech against the war, interfering with the draft, and it was upheld unanimously by the Supreme Court.